He treated the elderly man like a nobody until he discovered the truth. The private hospital stood in the city center like a silent symbol of status and power. Glass, steel, wide corridors, and a controlled silence gave the place an almost untouchable sense of superiority. There everything seemed to function within an invisible pattern where each person knew exactly their place. Daniel Moreira walked across the parking lot with firm, confident steps. He wore a tailored suit, discreet and expensive, that didn't need to draw attention to prove its worth. The watch on his wrist reflected the sunlight, and his posture conveyed effortless authority. He was used to being recognized, respected, and often admired. Daniel was a millionaire businessman, known in the corporate world for his strategic coolness and unerring decisions. For him, success was never a coincidence. It was the result of correct choices, extreme discipline, and an almost unwavering belief that the world rewarded those who truly deserved it. Those at the top had earned their place. Those at the bottom, in his view, simply hadn't done enough. That morning, Daniel wasn't there as a patient or ordinary visitor. He had been invited to finalize an important deal, a multi-million-dollar donation that would finance the construction of a new wing of the hospital. In recognition, his name would be engraved on an elegant plaque, positioned right at the main entrance. For many, this represented generosity. For Daniel, it was strategy, image reinforcement, permanent presence. As I walked towards the side entrance, something broke the harmony of the scene. Sitting on a simple bench away from the automatic doors was an elderly man. He was alone. He wore an old coat, clearly worn by time, its fabric too thin for the morning's chill. His shoes showed obvious signs of prolonged use. On his lap, he held an old brown briefcase, its edges worn, pressed tightly against his body as if it were something too important to let go of. The elderly man didn't ask for help. He didn't seek attention. He didn't speak to anyone. I was just watching. Daniel slowed his pace almost without realizing it. He didn't feel pity. He felt discomfort. The man's presence seemed out of place, like a flaw in an environment designed to convey exclusivity and control. It was as if that image shattered the narrative of perfection that the hospital tried to maintain. He looked around, hoping a security guard would resolve the situation. Nothing happened. People hurried past. Some looked away. Others simply pretended the old man didn't exist. Daniel considered moving on. Ignoring it, as he did with so many other situations, he considered irrelevant. After all, it wasn't his problem. But at that exact moment, the old man tried to get up. His movements were slow, careful. For a second, he seemed to lose his balance. He rested his hand on the bench, took a deep breath, and finally gave up, sitting down again. The effort was visible. Daniel felt a brief tightness in his chest. It wasn't empathy. It was irritation. This isn't the place for that, he thought, his jaw clenched. Without saying a word, he looked away and went into the hospital, leaving the old man behind, as if he were just another forgotten element of the urban landscape. Inside, everything returned to normal. The floor gleamed. The air was fresh. The atmosphere exuded organization. Well-trained employees recognized him immediately. They called him by name. They smiled respectfully. They offered him coffee. They led him to a private room. The meeting went exactly as Daniel had hoped. The hospital's board thanked him, praised his business acumen, and highlighted the positive impact of the donation. They discussed values, deadlines, and institutional visibility. Daniel Moreira's name was mentioned several times, always accompanied by admiration. He nodded calmly. It was part of his routine. Still, something was bothering him. No matter how hard she tried to concentrate, her mind kept returning to the image of the old man outside. The simple bench, the worn coat, the old briefcase, the attentive gaze, almost too serene for someone in that condition. Daniel was annoyed with himself. It didn't make sense. He didn't usually let himself be affected by this sort of thing. The meeting ended with handshakes and promises of future partnerships. Daniel stood up confidently and headed towards the exit. When the glass doors opened, he stopped. The old man was still there, sitting on the same bench, in the same position, as if time had only passed for the rest of the world. That was too much. Daniel felt a deep unease. Who waited so long? Who accepted being ignored like that? To him, that wasn't humility. It was a lack of awareness, driven more by irritation than any other emotion. He approached. He stopped in front of the old man, maintaining a rigid, superior posture. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His cold tone was enough. He asked if he was expecting someone. The old man slowly raised his eyes. His gaze was clear, attentive, and surprisingly firm. There was no fear, nor submission. I simply said, yes. Daniel crossed his arms and looked around, as if to emphasize the contrast between this simple man and the sophisticated environment of the hospital. He commented that this was a private hospital, that it wasn't a place for long waits, and that there were rules. The old man listened to everything in silence. Then he replied calmly that he knew that. The answer bothered Daniel. There was no embarrassment. There were no apologies, no rush to justify oneself. Daniel insisted. He said it might be better to look for another place, a more suitable location, a park bench perhaps. The old man remained calm. He only commented that he had waited in far worse places than that. The sentence hung in the air for a few seconds. Daniel felt a strange unease, something he couldn't explain. Still, he hardened his expression, ended the conversation coldly and walked away, convinced he had made it clear who was in charge. As he walked toward the car, he didn't look back. He was certain that that brief interaction meant absolutely nothing. Little did he know that that silent encounter had initiated a sequence of events that would change everything. That night, Daniel Moreira attended a private dinner with other influential businessmen from the city. The restaurant was sophisticated, quiet, and exclusive, frequented only by people who didn't need to look at the prices on the menu. The tables were spaced far apart, ensuring privacy. The low lighting created an atmosphere of almost solemn importance. The conversations revolved around investments, acquisitions, and future opportunities. Large numbers were discussed naturally, as if they were trivial details. Daniel participated actively, as he always had. He argued firmly, guided the reasoning, and received admiring glances. Still, something was different. Amidst the restrained laughter and calculated toasts, Daniel found himself distant. Several times his gaze wandered into the void. The image of the elderly man sitting on the hospital bench would appear in his mind without warning, interrupting his thoughts. He tried to ignore it. He took a sip of wine. He forced a smile. He told himself it was just tiredness. But when he got home that night, the discomfort intensified. The luxurious penthouse, with its expensive furniture and panoramic city views, seemed too big, too cold. The silence brought no peace, only echoed thoughts Daniel preferred to avoid. He slept badly. The next morning, the phone rang before the sun had fully risen. Daniel woke with a start and looked at the screen. It was the hospital director's number. That was unusual. He answered, his voice still hoarse from sleep. On the other end, he didn't find the usual cordial tone. The director's voice was tense, measured, almost heavy. He asked Daniel to go to the hospital as soon as possible. He said he needed to speak with him personally. Daniel asked if there were any problems with the donation or the contract. The director hesitated for a moment before replying that it wasn't something appropriate to discuss over the phone. As he hung up, Daniel felt a tightness in his stomach. He dressed quickly and left. During the journey, he tried to organize his thoughts. He considered technical, legal, and administrative possibilities. Nothing seemed serious enough to justify that tone, but upon arriving at the hospital, he immediately realized that something was wrong. The environment was too quiet. Employees walked around with serious expressions. Some spoke in hushed voices. Others avoided eye contact. The atmosphere was heavy, unlike anything Daniel had ever seen there before. He was led into a smaller room than the one used for the previous meeting. There was no coffee on the table. There were no compliments, just chairs, and a visible tension in the air. The director entered and carefully closed the door. He took a deep breath before beginning. He said that a patient had died during the early morning hours. Daniel inclined his head slightly in an automatic gesture of respect. Deaths were part of the routine in a hospital. He still didn't understand why it concerned him. Then the director pronounced the name, Augusto Leal. Daniel frowned. The name was unfamiliar to him. The director noticed the reaction and nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly that. He explained that Augusto Leal was the founder of the hospital, the man who, decades earlier, conceived, financed, and built that institution from scratch. All of that existed because of him. Daniel felt the impact, but he still didn't fully understand the situation. The director continued. He said that many years before, Augusto had distanced himself from administration. He had sold his shares, refused honors, and symbolic positions. He had chosen to live simply, away from the media, social events, and public recognition. He didn't like the spotlight. I would like to observe. I'd like to understand how people were treated when there weren't any big names involved. Then came the phrase that made Daniel's heart race. Few current employees knew what the founder really looked like. Silence filled the room. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The director explained that Augusto had arrived at the hospital without identifying himself. He explicitly asked not to receive any special treatment. He said he only wanted to observe the workings, get a feel for the environment, and see how patients and ordinary visitors were treated. He chose to sit outside, to wait, to watch. Daniel immediately remembered the bank, from the worn-out coat, from the old folder, from a keen eye. The director continued, now with a heavier voice. He said Augusto waited for hours. He saw people come and go. Some looked away. Others pretended he didn't exist. No employee asked if he needed help. Daniel felt his throat go dry. Then the director mentioned a specific episode. He said that Augusto, while still conscious, had commented on an elegant man who had approached him, a well-dressed, confident man who looked him up and down, who spoke coldly, making it clear that this was no place for him. Daniel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The director didn't need to say the name. That man was him. In silence, the director placed a brown envelope on the table. He said that Augusto had left it exclusively for Daniel Moreira. Daniel's hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. He opened it slowly, as if he knew the contents carried a greater weight than it appeared. Inside, there was only a sheet of paper folded once. The handwriting was simple, firm, and unhurried. Daniel read it. A person's character is revealed in how they treat those who have nothing to offer in return. The words hit Daniel hard. They weren't aggressive. They didn't accuse directly, but they were impossible to ignore. The director explained that that sentence was part of a larger letter. That was the only part intended for Daniel. The rest contained decisions already made by Augusto. The wing that was to be named after Daniel Moreira had been cancelled. The donation would continue, but it would be redirected. A significant portion of the funds would finance a permanent program of free care for vulnerable elderly people, conceived by Augusto before his death. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't try to argue. He didn't try to negotiate. For the first time in many years, I had nothing to say. He stood up silently and left the room carrying an invisible weight. As he passed through the hospital entrance, his eyes immediately went to the bench outside. It was empty. The simple bench where an extraordinary man had waited, been ignored, and judged. Daniel remained there for a few seconds, motionless, not knowing exactly what he felt. At that moment he understood that he had lost something much greater than prestige or visibility. I had missed the chance to act humanely when no one was watching, and this realization stayed with him all the way home, while the city continued on as usual, indifferent to the silent transformation that was beginning within him. Daniel Moreira drove home in complete silence. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't make any calls. The sound of the engine and the movement of the city seemed distant, as if he were traversing it all in a bubble of thoughts that he could no longer avoid. For years, Daniel had believed that control was everything. Control over decisions, over people, over his own image. He always knew how to behave in any environment, always had the right words, the right tone, the right moment. But now, for the first time, he felt he had lost something that could not be recovered with money, influence, or prestige. Upon reaching the penthouse, he dropped his keys on the table and walked slowly to the window. The city stretched out before him, illuminated, grand, alive. That view usually filled him with pride. That night, it brought only emptiness. He sat down on the sofa without turning on the lights. The handwritten phrase echoed in her mind, repeatedly, like a whisper impossible to silence. A person's character is revealed in how they treat those who have nothing to offer in return. Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered the beginning of his journey, when he was young, unknown, ignored in meeting rooms, when he heard doors close without explanation, when he promised himself that he would never allow himself to be treated as irrelevant again. At some point along the way, he confused respect with superiority. He confused success with human worth. He slept very little that night. The next morning he got up early. He dressed simply, something unusual for someone who always chose clothes as symbols of power. He left home without an agenda, without appointments, without a driver. He drove to the hospital. When he arrived, he didn't go inside immediately. He parked the car and walked to the bench outside, the same bench where Augusto Leal had waited, where he had been ignored, where he had been judged. Daniel sat down there. The morning chill was similar to that day. People hurried past, some talking on the phone, others engrossed in their own worries. Few noticed his presence, and, for the first time in many years, Daniel felt what it was. Like to be just another person. There were no cameras. There was no recognition. There was no power at all. Just him, the bench, and the silence. Minutes passed, then a few more. Daniel observed the activity at the hospital attentively. He saw elderly people being cared for with care. He saw others being ignored without realizing it. He saw small gestures that made all the difference, and others that hurt without leaving visible marks. Then he understood, with painful clarity, what Augustus had done. It wasn't a test. It wasn't a provocation. It was one last lesson. Augusto didn't want to be recognized. He didn't want tributes. He wanted to know if dignity still existed when status disappeared. Daniel stayed there longer than he had planned. When he stood up, something inside him had changed, not dramatically or immediately, but profoundly and irreversibly. In the days that followed, decisions began to be made, discreetly, silently, without public announcements, without nameplates, engraved in metal. Daniel began visiting institutions unannounced. He would sit, observe, and talk. He listened more than he spoke. He asked more than he asserted. He wasn't seeking public redemption. He knew that some flaws couldn't be erased, but they could be learned. Months later, the free senior citizen care program began to operate fully. It wasn't named after Daniel. It wasn't named after Augusto. It served only one purpose. Daniel observed everything from a distance, without interfering, without demanding recognition, without turning it into marketing. On one of his visits, he saw a gentleman sitting on a bench waiting to be seen. He approached slowly, sat down beside him, and struck up a conversation. He talked about simple things. He listened to stories. He laughed silently. At that moment, he realized something obvious, yet transformative. If I had acted this way from the beginning, none of this would have been necessary. As he left the hospital that day, Daniel stopped. Again in front of the bench outside, he ran his hand along the wooden backrest, now even more worn by time. He took a deep breath. He hadn't just treated an elderly person like a nobody. He had treated an extraordinary man as if he were nobody, and this truth would stay with him forever, not as punishment but as a constant reminder that someone's true worth lies not in what they possess, but in how they see others when no one is watching.